So tell me about the tapes.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you heard that indicates when Nixon first became aware of this break-in and the problem that it was causing him?
Well, as far as I know, he became aware of it the break-in occurred in the early morning hours of a Saturday, June 17th, 1972, and of course it was reported the very next day. So no doubt there must have been somebody. He was not in Washington. He was down at his home in Key Biscayne, Florida. Somebody must have alerted him that there were operatives in the re-election campaign that got arrested. And of course it was all over the newspapers the very next day. And then,
but they didn't know the next day that they were operatives from the re-election.
Oh, they did.
Oh, they did.
Oh yeah, they did. And then that Monday, let's see, 17, 18, be the 19th of July. That's when they were brought into court. And of course, that's when. Well, I'm getting my dates a little mixed up because it's been a while since I've dealt with this stuff. But it became pretty clear. That as Bob Woodward, who later wrote a book on this and did some investigating reporting on this, these are not your usual burglars. These guys were dressed in suits and ties. They were political operatives. The leader of the burglary team, James McCord, was a former CIA operative and a security consultant for the committee to re-elect the president. G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt were not actually part of the burglary team, but they were picked up by the FBI very quickly, I think within the next day or so. And obviously, because of their connections with both the committee to re-elect and their associations with the FBI and the Treasury Department, that's going to raise eyebrows.
Yeah. It's somewhat surprising, I have to say, that the FBI even picked them up. I mean, call me a cynic, but...
Well, that's a very interesting story too. I wish we had several hours to talk about this because there are all kinds of things. Of course, the break-in occurred in June. The month before, J. Edgar Hoover, who had been the longtime director of the FBI, had died. He probably would have been able to contain an investigation. But at the time of the break-in, there was a stand-in, a fellow named L. Patrick Gray, who was a Nixon appointee, who really didn't know how to control the FBI. The FBI got involved, I think, because of the obvious political implications. I mean, this was more than just a local burglary, which would have been handled by the D.C. police. And there are, of course, serious allegations about violations of campaign finance. These guys were found with lots of money on them. So there was an FBI investigation. And one of the problems for the White House was that the FBI, according to H.R. Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff, is the FBI investigation was getting out of control. They were, hunting down, they were going, it was a thorough investigation. They were tracking, this money that was being, eventually they found out was being laundered through Mexican banks. They picked up E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, who were not actually part of the burglary team, but were connected to these guys. So from the White House standpoint, L. Patrick Gray is not reining in his agents.
Right. So Nixon finds out about this, and his instinct is, out of respect and deference for the American citizens, we are going to have complete transparency, right?
Well, that's the problem. Well, of course, G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt, and James McCord, who were employed by the re-election committee, they all lost their jobs. They were immediately fired. But that presented another problem because these guys have got mounting legal and personal expenses. They don't have any jobs. They're facing trials and so forth. And
so there's the possibility of a deal, right?
Well, that would have to be handled within the District of Columbia court. Was the Nixon administration worried about that, and so did they come to their rescue with? Well, what they did legal support? Well, yes, they did provide what was called hush money, but of course it had to be, surreptitious. And the Nixon campaign had acquired a huge amount of undocumented cash. And a lot of it came from conservative Democrats who were frightened about what they saw as the radicalism of George McGovern, and wealthy conservative Democrats who wanted to curry favor with Nixon. So they had a lot of this cash on hand. But the problem is, I mean, the immediate problem was to get a postponement of the trial until after the election, which the defendant's lawyers succeeded in doing. So in a sense, the issue kind of got buried away. Now, the problem here was this. Nixon returned to Washington on June 20th, 1972. Okay, he had a conversation with his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, a very powerful figure in the administration. Problem is, now, Haldeman in his diary said that they talked about Watergate. We don't know what they talked about because 18 and a half minutes of that conversation disappeared. And later on, technical experts testified that it was because of an erasure. But 3 days after that, on June 23rd, 1972, Haldeman has a meeting with Nixon. And he says, okay, now we've got a clearer idea of what's going on. The FBI investigation is getting productive. In other words, it's going in places we don't want it to go, and they might uncover, connections between E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy with the Ellsberg break-in. Okay,
right.
But we think we have a way to stymie the FBI investigation, and that is we can go over to the CIA and talk to the deputy director, who was a Nixon appointee, along with the director, Richard Helms, who was a Democratic holdover, but they thought they might have something on him because of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And we'll ask them or demand of the CIA that they tell the FBI not to investigate laundered money because it would uncover CIA operations. And generally in the past, the FBI would back off. Well, the problem, and Nixon gives his approval to that, and it was recorded on tape, and so Nixon has committed obstruction of justice. Okay, right there.
Yeah,
And actually, that conversation became known as the Smoking Gun Conversation.
Right.
As it turned out, John Dean, who was the White House counsel, did go over to the CIA to ask them to put the kibosh on the FBI investigation. And this is an interesting commentary on what's happening in government. Both the deputy director, Vernon Walters, and Richard Helms, the director, said, this has nothing to do with the CIA. We're not going to stop the FBI investigation. Probably they were acting as honorable public servants, but they also knew that they felt that the Nixon administration was trying to implicate the CIA in illegal activities, and that this would hurt the CIA.
Interesting.
So
okay, let's jump back for a moment to the
Sure.
to the 18 and a half minutes that were erased.
Yeah.
I got to ask you, there's so much other incriminating bits of conversation on the tape. What could they possibly have been so afraid of that they erased that and not the rest?
Well, that's a good question, and there were various theories. When the 18 and a half minute gap was revealed in November of 1973 during some court proceedings. During some court proceedings, and the White House was trying to come up with an explanation, and the explanation they came up with was that back in June of 1973, before the tapes were discovered, Nixon was listening to recordings and having his secretary, Rosemary Woods, transcribe them. Now, she was very loyal to Nixon. And so the White House speculated that Rosemary Woods, in transcribing these tapes, accidentally had erased some, and she actually took the fall for it. Now, there's a famous picture of her trying to operate this transcription recording. It's not a recording, it's a player. It's a special machine with her foot on it, and she said she may have accidentally erased it by reaching back to answer a phone call. And so there's a famous picture of her doing this really convoluted stretch, to answer the phone but still keep her foot on the foot pedal of the playing machine. So I don't buy it. My speculation is I have a theory, but I'm not going to reveal it on
why not?
tape. Well, my theory is that somebody much higher up got into the tapes, heard a conversation. First of all, the tape. Here you got to get into the whole how the tapes are organized. Nobody was logging in tapes except, the Secret Service who operated the system. They would take a reel off the playing machine, which would have about 5.5 hours of conversation, mark the date on it, and that was about it. You have to play it, and the audio quality is very bad. It may be that somebody higher up heard some Watergate-related conversation, thought it might, if it didn't incriminate Nixon, it might make him look bad, even politically. Maybe use some 4-letter words or something, and started to erase it. But the problem is Nixon did not want the tapes destroyed because it's a record of his administration. But the problem is they've already erased 18.5 minutes, and there are not enough hours in the day or even in a year, to listen to all these tapes and selectively take out, just the Watergate-related stuff.
So you think that that's why the tapes remained in existence, was because it would have been far too laborious to go through and clean them out?
Yeah. Well, Nixon was aware that there was a taping system in there, but he never operated it. Nixon was, how shall I say, he was a physically awkward person. He was a klutz. And so the system was set up to operate automatically. In other words, when he went into the Oval Office or the old Executive Office Building office, a tape machine would automatically turn on. And then when somebody said something or if there was a meeting, it would start recording. And then it would shut down when the conversation stopped, and then the player itself, the recorder itself, would shut down when Nixon left the recording area. So, he never operated it, and I think the whole system went into the back of his mind. He just wasn't aware of the system day by day. But then, of course, when Watergate was starting to unravel in the spring of 1973, he started to listen to some tapes, but they were very hard to listen to. The audio quality ranges from almost unintelligible to fair.
So what do you think initiated his desire to have these tapes? Was it vanity? Was it...
No.
No? Okay.
Oh, no. I think for historical purposes.
Really?
Now, of course, there's always ego in here. Nixon believed that he was president during a transformative time in American history. And, Lyndon Johnson had extensive recordings of his telephone conversations. Kennedy had some recordings of what were called executive committee meetings during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So having a recording of his conversations would make sense, because when he would write his memoirs, he thought hopefully after the second term, he would have a good record of what went on. And I think this was especially true with foreign relations. With Nixon, foreign relations was really the central piece of not only his administration, but the presidency. The problem is his key advisor on national security was Henry Kissinger, who was answerable only to Nixon. But Henry Kissinger had a habit of, shall we say, putting his own spin on things. So Nixon would have the best record of what transpired over whether it's Vietnam, relations with the Soviet Union, any other aspect of foreign policy. So I think, it was for historical purposes.
So you've had sort of a unique vantage point into the presidency and the daily grind and goings-on of the presidency. And you've seen the underbelly of it. And
or rather heard the underbelly.
Right, that's right.
I didn't see anything.
That's right. So I guess my question is, coming away from this, are you just disgusted with American presidential politics or politics in general, or do you still have faith in the American democratic system, or this seems like such an abhorrent episode in American history, and it seems very unlikely that this is unique.
Well, no, I don't feel that way. I mean, my view on the United States, on the political system, is that, it's a pretty good system. It's a lot better than some other countries, in many respects. I wouldn't have high expectations. I mean, you're dealing with human beings here who, can be motivated by a complex blend of, their mental, their presuppositions, their ideals, their political pressures, and so forth. I have to say I was not a fan of Richard Nixon's when he was in office before I went to work on the tape staff. In fact, I disliked him, and a lot of people did. I still can't say I like the guy any better, but I think I have a far better understanding of the dynamics of certainly for his presidency. I think the presidency is a unique institution in the sense that one person can really kind of shape it. Nixon had, I think, some attitudes that really did him in. He had the belief that if others can do bad, unethical, or illegal things and get away with it, why can't I? Now, a lot of people have that attitude. It's not unique to Nixon. But I think Nixon had that, and I think it undid him. He was convinced, for example, that he was cheated out of the 1960 presidential election.
Yeah.
And it wasn't paranoia. I mean, there are serious allegations of voting fraud certainly in Illinois. That might have gone either way with Kennedy and Nixon. So,
well, we've seen that before recently too. I mean, or seen it again recently, I should say. Yeah, you're really rocking my worldview here. People will do wrong if they can, huh?
Well, let's put it this way. I think, to a certain extent, I think Nixon was trapped. I mean, once the burglars were discovered, and it was going to unravel a lot of things that they didn't want unraveled. I think the triggering event was the Ellsberg burglary. If that had not taken place.
And that was not known at the time.
No, that wasn't known except, of course, to John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, who approved it. Mm-hmm. Now, see, this is the problem. Some of Nixon's higher-ups were involved in approving or at least knowing about some of these illegal activities.
So now why didn't Nixon wash his hands of all of them? Was it a sort of circle the wagons mentality that came around, and he wanted to protect these guys because they had protected him? I mean, was there any opportunity for him to have saved himself in his presidency that he failed to?
Well, here's the problem, and this actually came out later on in March of 1973 when he has a key meeting with his White House counsel John Dean, who tells him that Watergate's a cancer on his presidency. It's not only protecting people like John Ehrlichman, but also H.R. Haldeman, who I think was the key figure in his administration. That is to say, if the Ellsberg burglary, if there were, and there were allegations of Muskie's presidential primary campaigns being sabotaged and so forth, if these came out, it might sink his reelection chances. And certainly key figures in administration would face serious charges. So I think, in a sense, he felt that he had to do this to save his presidency. And, of course, by June of 1972, George McGovern was well on his way to getting the Democratic presidential nomination. And for not only Nixon, but for many conservative Democrats, this is the horror of horrors,
Mm-hmm. All right, so let me ask you this to close up here. 40 years on, why is this important to remember? Why is it important to be talking about this?
Well, I guess my answer is kind of almost a cliche. Why is any part of the past important? I think, first of all, I think Watergate, the Nixon presidency, Vietnam are fascinating stories. I mean, there are tragic aspects to them, but they're fascinating parts of the American past, indeed the world past. The Nixon tapes are a unique collection of documents. I don't think there's anything like them. I remember who was the guy who investigated Bill Clinton?
Kenneth Starr.
Kenneth Starr came to give a speech, and I wanted to ask him. I didn't get a chance to ask him if he ever investigated whether Clinton kept any tapes. They would have been interesting. But anyway, I don't think any other president has. But the Nixon tapes are unique. I mean, they record practically everything that Nixon said in the White House, his office in the Executive Office Building. The telephone's there, the telephone in the Lincoln sitting room, and there are a couple other spots too. So, there's unrehearsed conversations. You hear how these people related to each other, how Nixon related to Henry Kissinger, or to H.R. Haldeman, or to his key political advisor, Charles Colson. And you do get a sense of Nixon's personality and the way he was kind of viewing American politics at that time, and the interplay between domestic politics and things that he was concerned about, obviously, which would be the economy and foreign relations, obviously Vietnam and so forth. So it's a unique record and well worth studying.
And we can probably find these tapes online. Is that?
Yes, they are. Unfortunately, I don't have the website, but the Miller Center for the Study of the Presidency has put online those tapes that have been released. There are some portions of the tapes that are still withheld for national security or privacy reasons, but I think a good portion of the tapes have been released or made available.
All right. Well, Chris Beam, historian and professor, thank you so much for being here on the
Eric,
Soapbox.
glad to be here.
Wonderful.